People often say they haven't yet found themselves, but the self is not something one finds. It is something one creates. Many of us take great comfort in the falsehood that is reality, but most of us forget the fragility of the construct that loosely roots us to the world around us. Even more of us subconsciously avoid the terrifying concept of self, because in the end, who are you really? Can you honestly answer the question without delving into more profound truths that shake the very foundation of your purpose and existence? Well, perhaps you too are suffering from the creepy syndrome, which is the name of the game we'll be exploring today. In this video, I aim to provide in-depth analyses for each of the 4 sessions and explain each of the brief yet convoluted endings. This journey will test our responses to trauma, the occult, judgment, and even our greatest desires. So prepare yourselves for what's to come. Our journey begins in a dimly lit room as we stand directly across from a seated therapist. This eerie scene is compounded even further as we hear the thunder crash from a looming storm, and the brief flash of light illuminates an eerie scene taken directly out of a nightmare. Countless eyeballs line the walls in the darkness, watching our every move, judging every decision we made. As we took our seat, the nameless therapist asked us to prepare ourselves for the upcoming sessions and reassured us that we could take breaks as needed. The first session was titled A Watchful Gaze and began with a nameless protagonist walking down a seemingly endless tunnel. As she moved forward in the darkness, we realized the protagonist had been plagued by a recurring nightmare. She recounted the vivid details via internal dialogue. I don't know how many nights I've been suffering from this nightmare. When I try to close my eyes, all I see is him, a cold, hate-filled stare. His face starts to distort until it completely consumes me. I feel him getting closer and closer. With a few more steps, she stated that she decided to reduce the number of hours she slept to avoid the nightmare. She even relocated to a remote area in the mountains in hopes of improving her mental state. But sadly, her condition worsened, and she began seeing the nightmarish visage even while she was awake. Eventually, she found numerous items strewn about the tunnel, including a newspaper clipping reporting a fatal car crash that involved a drunk driver resulting in the demise of the entire Miller family. After she read the report, she faintly remembered the family's last name, but was unable to recall her ties to them. She pressed forward and stumbled upon a picture of a boy named Daniel. As she contemplated the boy's identity, she found a pile of shredded paper. She pieced it together and realized that it was a child's drawing. It depicted a young boy, his mother, and his father all holding hands with smiles across their faces. This forced the protagonist to recall her family and the last time she saw them. Sadly, it was not a pleasant memory. She had gotten into an argument with her father but couldn't remember the events that followed. As she continued down the tunnel, she located a scalpel, an old prescription for an antipsychotic medication, and a locked container. Inside the container, the protagonist found a strange letter stating that Daniel was deceased and advised the reader to avoid looking at his face. She noted the eerie warning and continued moving forward. After a while, the exhaustion started creeping in and her eyelids got heavy. She decided to rest for a while, until she was stirred from her sleep by an inhuman visage peering at her from the darkness, inching closer and closer. The protagonist quickly grabbed the scalpel and slashed, and suddenly awoke from her nightmare, realizing that she had just cut herself in her sleep. Panicked, she gathered herself quickly and headed towards the exit. She found another picture of Daniel, but this time she saw what he looked like in his final moments. The happy young boy's face had been replaced by a ghastly image that was missing skin and hair from the accident. As she realized the imminent danger of her situation, she continued onward. The monstrous cries of the boy called out for his daddy, but there was no answer. After an untold amount of time enduring this endless horror, she came across a payphone and picked up the receiver. It was her father's voice. His message revealed that Laura, the protagonist, had left after their argument and was responsible for ending the lives of the Miller family in a horrific accident. With this revelation, Laura recalled that night perfectly and remembered that the deaths of the Miller family had impacted her so profoundly that she suffered from mental illness and was unable to sleep. Eventually, the pain and emotional trauma reached the point of no return, and Laura contemplated ending her own life. The hideous face that tormented her was a product of her own remorse, as she plunged deeper and deeper into the abyss of despair. It was time to confront her guilt and the monstrosity it had become. Armed with her newfound determination and acceptance of her grave mistake, Laura blasted away at the monster, pushing it back into the depths from which it came. As it retreated back further and further away, so too did the burden that had racked her mind, body, and soul. With one final shot, Laura finally exited the tunnel and was left with a message that stated, "Overcoming guilt illuminates the path forward like a candle." We suddenly returned from the session and awaited feedback from the therapist, who questioned how long our victory over the guilt would last. Those who lacked the resolve and mental resilience to resist the urge to end one's life would be crushed by the massive weight of guilt and chastised by the therapist. Eager to continue our rehabilitation, we selected the second session titled The Lord of the Road and delved into a new world and assumed the role of Inspector Rodriguez. As he investigated strange activity reported near a disbanded cult, where multiple homicides and ritualistic killings took place in the early 90s and 2000s. He set out on foot and located an abandoned home that seemed to be centuries old. He knocked on the door to announce his presence, but heard nobody on the inside and assumed it was empty. Not only that, but the door could not be opened without a key, so he continued to the west, where he would eventually locate a second home with a locked door. North of this home, he located an altar where a nearby fuse was laying on the ground, but no further clues were found. So he headed back to the area where the first home was found and headed east. As he retraced his steps, he noticed a corpse being pulled off screen. With his bolstered determination, he decided he would conduct a thorough investigation of the recently reported strange occurrences and continued east. Here he found an old journal where an unknown writer expressed his desire to leave the cult and made mention of the so-called god they worshipped. More carcasses littered the path, but eventually Inspector Rodriguez located a generator that was missing a power source. Fortunately, he had just what it needed to remedy the issue. Interestingly enough, the generator powered a nearby well. This well was not what it seemed, however, and actually had a mechanical ladder that led down to a sacrificial chamber beneath the ground. In these tunnels, a second book was found with Latin text that the inspector was unable to translate, but more on this later. As he prepared to leave the grounds, the main room was littered with dozens of corpses that had been sacrificed to some dark being. Just as suddenly as the gruesome display appeared, it disappeared as if it were simply a figment of Inspector Rodriguez's imagination. Spooked, he decided to get back to his car and return to the station to report his findings, but when he arrived, his vehicle was nowhere to be found. In its place was a massive pool of blood, a dismembered body, and a nearby key. Immediately after collecting the key, half of the corpse animated itself and began hungrily crawling towards the inspector. Following his instincts, he skipped past the first house and ran west to the second house he had located. Fortunately, his gut feeling was right, and he burst through the door as the other zombie-like creatures pursued him. Once he was inside, he found another bloody scene. A nearby note explained the writer's concern that the Dark Lord would not accept Martha's sacrifice since she was no longer a virgin, courtesy of the writer. This little detail was hidden from the cult, but likely surfaced and resulted in the bloodbath in the living area, and explained the lifeless body sprawled on the floor. The upstairs room had yet another key that was labeled Martha's house, and is probably how the writer and Martha were able to have their affair. Upon exiting the house, Inspector Rodriguez followed a new trail of blood and was visited by a ghost who asked to be set free. As he dissipated into thin air, he left behind a circular artifact of no clear importance. The inspector continued down the newly carved path and found a Latin dictionary, which proved instrumental in translating the occult text strewn about the site. He returned to the central area and followed another fresh trail of blood back towards the east. Now, a new path had opened north of the generator and led to a strange altar that was missing a piece. The inspector inserted the artifact that he was given by the ghost and heard a satisfying click, but nothing else happened. As he walked away, a surge of ghosts were expelled from the altar, free from the demon lord whose appetite for flesh and souls alike was insatiable. On the way back, he took a detour and revisited the well to translate the text of the Latin manuscript. It hinted towards a ceremonial dagger and referred to the altar as a portal to our world. Armed with this newfound knowledge, there was only one other place to explore. The inspector headed toward the home just south of the road and used Martha's key. Just as he had anticipated, the lock engaged and he entered. As he explored the upstairs area, he found a diary that belonged to Martha herself, who laid in a pool of her own blood just meters away. The diary mentioned that she was pregnant with Thomas's child and that she feared what would happen if Father found out. She decided it would be best to use the dagger to beg for forgiveness from the demonic entity they so fervently worshipped, but sadly, she was struck down before she could make the journey. Suddenly, Martha gasped for help before she faded into darkness. She was still alive, but barely. Inspector Rodriguez had a choice. Would he complete the ritual, or confront the false god to end his tyrannous reign? Those of weak constitution would enact the ritual and serve up their entrails to the demon unwillingly. But those with strong conviction would make their way to the altar, enter the shadow realm, and pierce the demon's heart, releasing his stranglehold from the living and dead alike. Inspector Rodriguez would emerge victorious, but before he could celebrate his victory over evil, he had to write the best damn police report you could imagine. When we came to, the therapist congratulated our efforts and our ability to defy a deity worshipped by our fellow man. With that, we moved on to the third session titled The Red Button. Immediately upon activating the session, we found ourselves in some sort of military bunker, complete with an ominous computer console, a cup of coffee, a few pens, and a ringing telephone. It was time to activate the protocol, but first, we would need to locate a pen and paper to take down our orders once we answered the phone. Fortunately, our desk had several pens to choose from, but not a scrap of paper was in sight. As we left the communications room in search of paper, we noted the layout of the bunker. Adjacent to the comms room was the machine room that was blocked off by a thick metal door. There was also a small power source, similar to a fuse box, behind a glass case, and the missile room guarded by two impenetrable bars. Lastly was the exit, which led to the surface, where a satellite stood at the ready to receive and transmit messages, alongside a crowbar and an old paper notice that warned against the negative effects of radiation. We collected both the warning to use as scrap paper and the hook. As we returned to the bunker, we noticed a shiny object inside of one of the grated vents. We used the hook, and to our surprise, we found the floppy disk required to open the machine room. Immediately after retrieving the disk, we saw visions of bloody handprints plastered across the wall with a sickening wet sound. We returned to the communications room, and with pen and paper in hand, we answered the phone. The launch order had been confirmed. Today was the day the world would end. As we attempted to enter the code, the power turned off. We headed straight for the power source and used a spare screwdriver to remove the glass cover. We flipped the switches necessary to reactivate the power and returned to the communications room to carry out our orders. With the machine room opened, we needed to ensure that the generator had sufficient fuel and that each of the valves were opened correctly. We fueled the generator and inserted the spare valves we located strewn about the bunker. With the central console powered, we removed each of the bars preventing entry into the missile room. As we left towards our final destination, we took note of the fire extinguisher and witnessed yet another hallucination. This time the word disorder was displayed and flashed across our eyes, and a blood-red skull screamed its final protest before disappearing into the recesses of our mind. Inside the missile room were 4 separate consoles, each responsible for activating a specific part of the weapon of mass destruction: the nuclear head, fuel systems 1 and 2, and the engine system. As each of the components were brought online, we were bombarded with more disturbing hallucinations that increased in frequency. It was almost impossible to distinguish between these dark images and reality, as the two realms seemingly intertwined. After all 4 systems were live, the only thing left to do was press the red button. A small message window next to the red button reminded us of the ramifications of our decision via an emotionless prompt that read, "Destroy the world?" We had 2 options. We could either press the button and end the world as we know it, or we could step away from the console and refuse to mindlessly follow these orders. Those who were loyal to the end were compared to dogs who lacked the rebellious spirit needed to make their own decisions and trust their own judgment. However, those who disobeyed the orders were likened to pious souls who saw hope in humanity despite the chaotic state the world was in. And with that, we were on to the final session titled Nocturne. As the session started, we witnessed the tail end of a conversation between Sarah and her older sister, who was away from home at college. She apologized and regretted how her younger sibling was often left home alone while their mother tirelessly worked away to provide. But Sarah mentioned that she had a plan. She had visited a magical forum and discovered a way to make her mom work less and be at home much more often. All she had to do was perform a specific ritual. Her sister warned against it and cautioned her to be careful before she ended the call. Sarah, determined to have her mom back home as soon as possible, was unfazed and began carrying out the steps. First, she had to turn on each of the lights in the house. The home she lived in was massive and had numerous light fixtures strewn about the various living areas and rooms. As she approached the kitchen, the lights turned off and she was chased by the pounding footsteps of an unseen intruder. She quickly left the room and completed the ritual. Once all the lights were on, all she had to do was make her wish in front of a mirror, turn off all of the lights, and return to bed. Sarah wished that her mom was always with her and then proceeded to turn off all the lights. As she passed by the kitchen for a second time, she noticed strange scratch marks on the wall that weren't there before. Beyond the light, just hidden in the darkest corner of the room, a shadowy figure complete with inhuman features and sharpened claws scurried away, waiting for the perfect time to strike. Sarah was forced to hide multiple times and control her breathing to avoid being caught by the vicious monster. Eventually, she made it to her bedroom and turned off the final light. As she prepared to go to bed, the monster appeared yet again. This time, she had to make the most important decision of her life. Should she complete the ritual in hopes that the monster would disappear, or should she escape by jumping out of the window? Those blinded by the promises of dark magic would loyally return to bed only to be devoured by the shadowy creature. But those who could see through the veil of deceit would leap out of the window to safety and abandon all hope in the dark arts. Now, with all the sessions completed, the cumulative outcomes of each session would allow us to receive the corresponding ending. If the majority of the sessions suffered the bad scenarios indicated by the red check mark, the therapist would appear to us in a grotesque form that judged us harshly for our inability to discern reality from fiction. He then stated that there was some truth in dreams, and that only through them could we find ourselves. The therapist bid us farewell and eerily wished for us to have sweet dreams as he faded into darkness. The bad ending essentially highlights the player's inability to cope with the harshness of reality and shows how a damaged mind can plague itself with inexplicable horrors. If an equal amount of the sessions were completed with good and bad scenarios, the therapist would simply state that the data was inconclusive and that further testing was needed, marking the intermediate ending. If the majority of the sessions were completed with good scenarios, indicated by green check marks, we were treated with an incredibly confusing scene featuring us, the player character, walking towards a mirror. However, the reflection was not of the young man. It was none other than the elderly therapist himself. As the two locked eyes in horror, the player asked the one question with no true answer: who am I really? As the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, the good ending shows how even those of sound mind and judgment still have difficulty grasping the more profound things in life. Was the therapist even real? Were we the therapist? Or was something much darker taking place? Had the glimpse into our troubled mind opened a portal to a whole different realm of existence? I'll let you decide. And until next time, it's the Inhuman One signing out. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like and subscribe. It helps the channel out immensely. Consider becoming a member for exclusive perks like emojis, extra videos, and more. Or check out my Patreon for behind-the-scenes content. Join the Inhuman community today.